I was just going to take notes, by the way.
Okay. Hi, I'm Daniel Kraywitz. Welcome to the UT Mises Circle. Today our topic is money as a form of reciprocal altruism. So this is an offhand comment that Richard Dawkins made in The Selfish Gene, and Nick Szebo took it up as paper shelling out, but I don't think that the topic has really been developed very much. So that's kind of what I'm writing about now. So that's what I want to. I think this is actually a rather insightful way to think about money. So first I'll talk about why we can use concepts from biology in economics, and then I'll talk a little bit about why money is a problem and why it can be considered a form of altruism. And then I'll talk about reciprocal altruism and how money satisfies the definition and what we can learn about theory of money from that. And so biology and economics, evolutionary theory, to be more precise, they're both basically game theory, and they're both about trying to explain the things we observe in terms of optimal strategies under different sets of incentives. So they're both very individualistic. Earlier in the 20th century in biology, there was this idea called group selection. The idea is that animals can do things that are good for the group. So a behavior can evolve if it is beneficial for the population as a whole. So we don't believe that anymore. Anytime there is cooperation or altruism among a group of animals, we have to explain that in terms of the individual benefit to each animal, not in terms of what's socially beneficial. So there is this idea has been revived with a new theory called multi-level selection theory, but the individual selection is recognized as being the most important factor and normally the one that matters. And this is true in economics too, except that usually what we need to show is a little bit the other way around, because we'll have some government program or intervention or regulation, and we'll be trying to argue that it's not going to work because it fails to be individually beneficial. Be some rule that says, everyone has to be paid a certain minimum amount per hour or something, and we'll say that the strategy that is most the strategy that wins out under these circumstances is one in which you fire the employees with the lowest marginal productivity and you replace them with machines. So the result is unemployment rather than an increase in the wages of the poorest people. The difference between biology and economics is that in economics, people can have very different preferences. There's a different idea about the nature of value. So in economics, we relate everything to people's consumption, the things that give them immediate pleasure, but people can be very different in what sorts of things they like, and we have to take that into account whenever we talk about anything in economics. Whereas in biology, there's only one source of value, and that is reproductive success. So everything can be related to that. And so in biology, we can have interpersonal comparisons of value. Well, not interpersonal, but inter-life form, but not in economics. So other than that's really the main difference. So anything in biology that we can transport into economics and take into account this difference in the nature of value, that will work, and we can do that. So so altruism. When we observe behavior in the real world, ultimately we can assume that this behavior has to be self-interested in some way, because people tend to behave in ways that ultimately give them pleasure. People can make themselves happy by helping other people, but if they didn't have that feeling, then they wouldn't do it. And it's the same in biology. When we see a bunch of animals that all appear to be benefiting one another, we want to explain that in terms of what is ultimately selfish. So the definition of altruism in biology is that we have an experimental concept of fitness, and we say, and we observe an animal that is reducing its own fitness and improving the fitness of another. But since this is an experimental definition, we can assume that ultimately the animal is improving its own fitness in the long term, or in some way that we don't know. But by an experimental definition of fitness, it looks like an animal is reducing its own fitness and benefiting another. And that's something that we always have to explain if we observe it in biology. So the reason that money is a form of altruism is that when you accept money in payments, you are giving up something that can be productive, or you're giving away a service or a good that can be consumed, and in exchange you're taking tokens, basically. Or you are taking something that you don't actually intend to consume. Whether we're talking about gold coins or dollars or bitcoins, you're essentially, you're trading something that can be consumed for something that you don't intend to consume.
You don't intend to consume it right away. Or actually, yeah, at all.
Yeah, I mean, you can have a consumable good that's used as money, but when it's used as a medium of exchange, it's not consumed in the way that it's used. So that is a form of altruism, and of course, people who are trying to grab lots and lots of money, you wouldn't normally think that they're feeling very altruistic about it, but economics and biology are behavioral. We don't need to ask about people's emotions. We want to explain what they actually do. So it's a perfectly good way of thinking about money. Now, let me make another comparison here. Let's sort of imagine a village where that doesn't have money, and people are all agriculturalists, and they all sort of are self-sufficient. There's not a lot of trade going on in this village. So suppose one of us in the village said, why don't we all sort of be communists, and we'll all produce as much as we can and put it in sort of a communal store and then divide it out as we need it, right? People would say, well, there's kind of a problem with that because, like, say I work hard to produce a lot. How do I know everybody else is? They can benefit by slacking off or by withholding some of the produce, there is a theoretical benefit, specialization and division of labor, but there's also this problem of slacking off and withholding resources. So then let's say, well, why don't we use some sort of token, and when you, instead of being communists, you get paid in the token when you give up some resource by the person who takes it. And then we can all produce first and collect the tokens for it and then spend them later to distribute the resources, right? There's actually a very similar problem, because someone can say, well, like, what if I work hard and I collect all of these tokens and then nobody else wants to have them? It's a very similar problem, because in both cases you have to invest in what everybody else is going to do, and how are you going to be assured that they will behave correctly? So the difference is that with the money economy, we can have an argument to show that the money is individually beneficial, but in a communist society, we can only argue that for very small groups, whereas the money system can become arbitrarily large. So there's this idea in biology called reciprocal altruism, and the idea is that there is opportunity from receiving favors from other animals in a group. So what we imagine is that a group of animals gives out favors to whoever is in need at the time, and there's a greater benefit from the expectation of receiving favors later. So it's worthwhile to give them out as well. And we usually study reciprocal altruism in pairs, because that's more commonly observed, and it's also the more difficult case theoretically. Once you get two animals and you can get them to show how they will be reciprocally altruistic to one another, it's really pretty easy to generalize it to more. But what was I going to say about that? But for the case of money, we're really thinking about a whole population of animals being altruistic to one another. So the idea of, so we study reciprocal altruism with repeated games, and the idea is that for a wide variety of games in game theory, there is one strategy that is the equilibrium when the game is only played once, but if the game is repeated an indefinite number of times, a different strategy is the most effective one. And the reason, the difference between one strategy and another is the probability that the game will be replayed. So one kind of game that you're probably familiar with is the prisoner's dilemma. So anyway, look it up if you haven't heard of that. But the idea is that if you play the game once, defect, and they could do a lot better if they both cooperated, have a possibility of tricking the other one and getting an even greater benefit. They both have to defect and can't cooperate. But if the prisoner's dilemma game is played repeatedly, then the cooperative strategy is the best one, and it produces the greater benefit for both players. And really, well, not just the cooperative strategy, but the best strategy is one called tit for tat. And what this means is that you start out cooperating, and then you repeat whatever the other player does. So if they cooperate, you keep cooperating. If they defect, then you punish them by defecting the next time. This is the strategy that always wins out, and if everybody is using it, that just means that everybody is cooperating. But there's a wide variety of games that show similar features. There's kind of a problem with using if you get the benefit after you see what the other player does. So it's not quite like mutualism. But there are other games where alternating strategy wins out, where there needs to be repeated interaction, and there needs to be a method of punishing the other player if they don't reciprocate. So, so it's easy to see how close together in an economy, and there are lots of opportunities to trade. If there weren't, then we wouldn't use money. But because we're a social species, then there is that possible benefit. And there's the way this is it's a very simple system, and it allows for enormous groups to cooperate with one another without knowing who they are or having any contact. You can have, a trade route from China to
You talked about how accumulating money is altruistic.
Yeah.
And I think you have to distinguish how someone is accumulating money. Like, it doesn't count when somebody just prints their own money.
Yeah, very good point. Yes. So let's define. Yeah. So I should define what monetary behavior is. But yeah, if you are printing out tons of money, then you're cheating, and that reduces the success of the money system as a form of reciprocal.
Activity into whatever social organization you're part of, like your village or an international economy. You're giving away
So what this
All our weekly videos, they lose faith.
Yeah, right.
Money is a kind of sacredness, just like,
Yeah.
sacredness is in conflict. It has to be maintained socially.
I think we're back.
Do you know when we got cut off?
I think it was pretty,
Talking about divisibility and fungibility.
yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, traditional qualities of money, they all work because they turn the money good into just a number that's associated with each person, which can be easily verified, and which can be collected only by giving out favors to other people. So and let's see, what are some other traditional qualities? Well, scarcity, of course, that's another one that's important.
Divisibility.
And
Transferability.
mention those ones.
Divisibility.
Transferability, yeah, and divisibility, and portability. That's another important one. And of course, when we have a global economy and people want to trade from across the world, we want money that's teleportable, not just portable. Before we had worldwide communication, a money like Bitcoin would have been impossible, whereas a money like gold was fantastic, because even if you don't know anything about what happens in China, you can be pretty sure that they don't know how to manufacture gold, right? They can't just, they don't have alchemy that will just produce tons and tons of it and ruin the system. But now that we all have a global system of communication, we can just use computers to implement a system that just assigns a number to different people, or in Bitcoin's private keys, of course, and they're very easily transferred and very difficult to counterfeit. In fact, not possible unless the standard cryptographic assumptions are broken. So, Bitcoin is the best system of reciprocal altruism that's been developed so far, and we can see that through the history of Bitcoin that people have continuously found more value in adopting that system and becoming a part of it, because they expect that in the future the degree of cooperation and that will be possible with it will be much greater than is possible today. And that's my talk. Do we have any questions?
Well, you described the same things that are basically talked about in shelling out.
Yeah.
So what makes this different than like the traditional Austrian school money origin story?
Well, nothing really. I mean, this stuff is all Austrian.
One of its leading titles. This will be a debate between the Austrian theory.
Well, the next. Well, I was thinking of talking about how Nick Szebo was different in the next discussion.
Cliffhanger.
Because it's it's a big topic. There's a lot of stuff in it. But let's talk about what.
I mean, I guess one difference that I would say, and it's not necessarily I wouldn't say that it contradicts Austrian theory, but makes it clearer. The typical Austrian story starts with barter, which is ultimately sort of a double coincidence of wants. It's described as such, but Nick Szebo talks more like there's more coincidences that are necessary for people to actually be able to cooperate with one another. So,
okay, I'm going to disagree with that a little bit. So it's possible.
It
seems like Menger may have really been thinking about a barter system in which people are trading consumable goods with one another, like produced stuff that they can consume, like food and clothing or whatever. But what Nick Szebo talks about in his recent blog posts is that the proto-monies would also have been used for things like bride prices or tribute and things like that. But I would say that in Austrian theory, it is still barter, because any sort of trade is barter, even if you're trading rides or something. I mean, not
Sure.
but
And I was also talking more about kind of the standard Austrian story.
and
as opposed to perhaps like what Menger.
well, let me point out one other thing. There's a book called Debt that I haven't read yet, but I really need to get to.
The first 100 pages are great. You can stop at that point, but those are great.
But
And it's very similar to, it's really the same account that Szebo gives in showing out of the original, thank you, that's the word I was looking for.
So, but one of the things that people have talked to me about in this book is how debt is important to the origin of money. But if we're trading future goods for present goods, I would say that's still barter. It's just future for present, right? That's really the only difference. So ultimately, in
Debt is a negative value judgment about certain kinds of futures. The main difference between Graeber's account and Szebo's account is tone.
Okay.
They give essentially the same origin story.
Like in Austrian theory, there are a lot of terms that are extremely abstract, and they have kind of a different connotation in everyday talk. Like when we talk about the free market, lots of people are sort of thinking about what Karl Marx called the monetary nexus, the money nexus. So the set of trades that are done with money, but when we talk about the free market, we're really just talking about the total of the voluntary transactions, which can be, friendship, or can be, anything that, any kind of interaction that is voluntary on both sides. And this is the same sort of thing. Like when we're talking about a barter system, that we don't have to assume that it contains the kind of connotation that we might often think of with normally with a barter system. We're just talking about really trade without a good that is the standard money unit.
That kind of reminds me of a question I had before. But when we talk about scarcity as being a desirable property of money, when you're defining money as delayed reciprocal altruism, doesn't scarcity just mean people shouldn't be able to get the tokens without providing a voluntary service or good?
Yeah, exactly. So
it's not directly about the quantity of tokens. It's more about you have to get them by loaning into the economy.
Yeah. We want there to be like an infinitely special, because there's a natural trade-off between divisibility and scarcity, right? And you get into Zeno's paradox land, and you're like, which do you want?
No, those are totally, no, we can, scarcity,
Yeah, they are different.
Scarcity is another word that kind of has connotations that aren't what we mean. When we talk about scarcity, all that really means is that effort is required to get it. So when we want a money good, we want something that can't be increased exponentially, right? So the Federal Reserve does take effort to create dollars, but it takes about as much effort as to press the 0 key on your keyboard to decatuple the amount of money, right? So there's not very much effort, and
See, I don't think it's the effort though. I think it's the printing new dollars is not putting a product or service into the market without receiving an immediate reward back.
Yeah.
It's
Well, I'm talking about the definition of scarcity.
Right.
So technically, there is a sense in which dollars are scarce, but their yield curve is exponential for the amount of cost, and the cost of pressing 0 key. So that's not a good money because of that. Whereas something like gold, it's very difficult to increase the supply of gold. So that works a lot better. But with Bitcoins are even better because we just have a set amount and that's it. And nobody can do nobody can add to the sum total at all.
Possibly conciliating where both of you are going is that it isn't just pressing 0, right? Scarcity isn't affected until the tokens are in the hands of a player as a player in the economy. So until it actually gets loaned for 0 interest to a bank, and that finds its way into someone's hands who might use it for something that's personal project or the business they run or something, that's the point at which the money supply. It's not the moment they run off the press. But this sounds like a small difference, but it's actually a big difference because it points out to his idea that the problem with violating scarcity in that way is that if somebody is just getting it for free without putting in any effort, and those are actually two different ways of looking at the elephant.
I disagree with that. I would say the supply increases the moment that you create the new money.
No, it's only the potential for that to become supply. It's dangerously sitting there on paper, and somebody could take advantage of their stash, but until they do, it's not.
You didn't let me finish talking. The supply increases the moment it's created, but when it enters the economy, that's when price increases supply. So those are two different things. That's how it works. So,
I want to emphasize the point I was trying to make before. So going back to these simple examples, a baker in some village who's baking bread all day and getting money for it and not spending it. He's actually spent an entire day of production that he's just given to his customers, and he hasn't taken back anything yet. And so that accumulation of money is a representation of delayed reciprocal altruism. He gave away his bread. He hasn't asked for anything back yet.
Yeah.
Somebody who prints dollars on a printing press, they might work really hard. They might have heavy reams of paper they have to lift, and they might do a lot of effort. There might be a lot of effort involved in printing those dollars. But that's not delayed reciprocal altruism because they haven't given anybody anything while they printed those dollars. So I don't like to talk about, for a strict definition of scarcity, effort, it makes sense. But when you're talking about delayed reciprocal altruism, not all effort is equivalent.
Right. And so we were talking about the traditional qualities of good money. So I think that what you're saying here is that scarcity isn't really the right word that we should be using. Really what we want is something where the difficulty of increasing the supply can be expected to be a lot greater under most circumstances than the difficulty of actually doing productive work and trading for it.
Sure.
And this kind of raises the interesting question of whether producing gold should be considered socially beneficial if it's a form of money. Because the Austrians, they're all gold fetishists, but really, there is kind of some truth to what Warren Buffett was saying, how you spend billions of dollars to take gold out of the earth, and then you spend a lot more to guard it somewhere else, Although he didn't say that originally. I checked on that quote, and it's quite old. That story anyway. Yeah.
I would even say that the issuing new bitcoins via mining is somewhat. I don't think that act of minting new bitcoins is delayed reciprocal altruism. The only the benefit to Bitcoin is that it's programmed to exponentially decrease over time.
Right.
So it's like you have this problem of you have to get the money into circulation somehow, and the least worst way to do it is to exponentially inflate an exponentially decaying inflation over time. But still,
Well, that's why the miners are so obnoxious, and they have because they're not. they're not as invested in the system. Although, let me say, it has, the fact that there's a capital investment to be a miner now, that makes them much better. I'm still thinking about the miners from like 2012 and 13 who were much more annoying.
Yeah, they would just turn on, they would add any transactions because they didn't have to.
Right. There were even people who wrote miners that they only cared about the subsidy, and even though there were transaction fees in the block, they didn't claim them because they were just like, I just want my 25 Bitcoins.
Yeah. So those were just lost, you mean?
Oh yeah, the supply is reduced from the theoretical maximum because there were coins that were weren't minted.
Yeah.
I think actually the theory was that those blocks were minted by botnets.
Yeah.
That had very simple programming and would just mine blocks and didn't check to see if there was a transaction key they could claim.
There's something interesting that I learned recently. There's around something like 900 coins that have been destroyed because there was a bug in the P2Pool software which translated the word, I don't remember, but it was some word, just ASCII text. What it uses that Bitcoin. So and it's a completely meaningless script, and so it produces Bitcoins that can't be redeemed. So you mine on P2Pool and it produces a block that just destroys the subsidy instead of distributing it to people sometimes.
I guess the most altruistic act would be the people who send their coins to the Bitcoin Eater address.
Oh yeah. So what is the Bitcoin Eater? Is that just an obviously fake address?
Yes. So somebody made a string. It says don't send, and then they calculated the correct checksum, or like the last few digits to make the checksum come out right. And nobody has a private key whose public key hash equals that phrase. Like it probably exists based on what we know about SHA-256.
Yeah.
But it's not possible to find it.
Yeah.
So those coins that are sent to that address almost certainly in the lifetime of the solar system will never be spent.
And how many have been sent there?
I guess I can look that up real quick.
Yeah, Michael's got it up here. Bitcoin Eater address don't send. Okay, yeah, there's no way you could mine that.
It only has 1.875.
Man, people aren't being very altruistic, are they? Could donate to the whole Bitcoin economy by sending to that.
The opposite.
Yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about the bear whale? Does anybody want to talk about that?
Well, do we want to keep that in the broadcast, or?
Oh, okay. Well,
these are going to be archived.
Sure. Okay. Well, unless we have more questions about this topic, I'm done going through what I had on it. So
we can continue next week on the
next
segment of the
series.
Excellent.
All right. Well, do we have any questions? We have Dallas on the hangout with us. Do you guys want to add any comments or questions?
About price. We got one question here.
All the way from Texas.
Hello there. Thank you. I did have something on that.
Go ahead.
You guys, I'm gonna just turn our volume up. Okay. When you guys were talking about the baker who bakes bread or cakes before selling them, and that is then an example of reciprocal altruism. I wanted to point out that what's actually happening there is that the person making the bread or the cake or whatever charges a price for it, and the price, like what's inbuilt in that price, is the effort that they put into making the cake before selling it. Like actually, if they had a magic wand and they could wave them into existence, the price would be lower versus, you know, if they had to, like, I don't know, milk the cow and, you know, grow the wheat themselves and mill it and yada yada and do all this extra labor, the price would just be higher. And I didn't think that it was a really good example. And I don't know if the, I think, I'm not sure who put it forward, sorry. If you,
well, the idea is that all economic productivity that is traded in exchange for money is a form of altruism, and it becomes reciprocal altruism when you redeem goods later, like when you spend the money in other, what?
Delayed altruism.
Right, so so you spend the money later and other people give you goods for it, so then they're being altruistic to you. And,
okay, just briefly,
the reason that the money system is...
Do you mind defining altruism versus trade? Like, can you help us distinguish between? I think the word barter was used earlier, and I thought that was, you know, that made sense. Can you just help us distinguish between bartering and altruism, like just in your words?
The definition of altruism is an animal reduces its fitness and at the same time increases the fitness of another animal. And we have an experimental definition of fitness, and we try to explain how that behavior is individually beneficial to the animal doing it. So when I give a service or a consumable good to someone else in exchange for a token that I don't intend to consume, that's altruistic because I'm giving up resources in exchange for a token that isn't consumable. And it's explained by the fact that if everybody behaves in this way, then they can all benefit more because there can be an increased division of labor and trade between them.
Okay.
I don't know exactly how I want to put this, but I think the part that wasn't coming across to him is that sort of money is being ignored as valueless temporarily in the model of saying that the baker is doing reciprocal altruism, saying the baker's giving things of real value and getting something valueless in return. We're ultimately giving an argument for how the thing becomes valuable, the thing being money, right? But we're starting out, the original perspective of taking it as I was a purely altruistic, giving away the cake I just baked, is that you're getting this valueless thing.
So actually, I just realized that there was something missing from my discussion just now, and that is that I didn't explain how the money system is individually beneficial, whereas the communist system isn't. And the reason has to do with the fact that if you are successful and you correctly, you begin to make the investment in the money at the beginning, then you grow richer compared to everyone else. But that does not happen when we're trying to implement communism. So there is an individual benefit towards developing a money system, which is that the early adopters become wealthy. And of course, we also see that in Bitcoin. And I think that explains a lot about why Bitcoin has been so successful, even though it is still a relatively small economy. It's just the fact that any initial success of Bitcoin can be interpreted by many people as being a sign of future success, because they'll know that other people will behave that way and want to be early adopters. So much more likely to want to be early adopters in Bitcoin than, say, something like Ethereum, which doesn't have a fixed supply and doesn't produce that same kind of benefits to early adopters. So that concludes the discussion. I missed that part earlier, but now
we have to vacate the room, so thank you for answering the question. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Joining us.
So, last question?
Yeah,